Hey everyone, we had a clerical error in our GPU benchmark for Gears of War 4, which has now been fully rectified with this content today. And that error was really a result primarily of having 3 different people working on the benchmarks. This is a growing operation. And also a mix of the game having 40 graphics settings and a Python script to interpret data, and then presentmon, which is also sort of new to benchmarking because it is a DX12 title. So there were a lot of variables going on, and it's been corrected. Basically, the error boils down to a simple thing. It's chart generation. All of the tests, thankfully, were actually valid. The results were valid, tests were good, the data was accurate, but they weren't put on the right charts. So basically, we had AMD and NVIDIA on the same chart using different settings for 1440p and for 1080p. 4K was fine. So the chart generation error created an unintentional misrepresentation of data. For that, you have my apologies. I have corrected that. We've also done some extra tests now. So now we have a throw-in card of the GTX 1063 GB that was not on there originally. Thought that'd be fun to look at, the difference of 3 versus 6 GB performance. We've added that. We also have proper ultra tests this time for 1080p and 1440. So now we have 1440, 1080p at high and at ultra, and we have 4K at high as previously. Let's get to it. First off, Gears of War 4 is a UWP title that's DirectX 12 enabled, which means that usual testing via FPS overlays isn't supported. For that reason, we're using presentmon with an in-house built Python script to analyze the data and create 1% and 0.1% low outputs that we use in our normal fraps and fraps testing. And the game also has a few dozen graphic settings, as I said, about 40, that really complicate the testing. But we've gone through them and defined the majority of them in the article, and we've also made sure that they are applying correctly to the different settings used for testing. What you're looking at now is the first 30 seconds of the Gears of War 4 benchmark. This is the course that we use primarily for graphics testing, with our presentmon command set to expire right around when the camera angle changes. You can also see our Gears of War 4 maximum graphics video, which shows some of this benchmark in full on the channel. We used high settings for 4K and properly used ultra settings at 1440p and 1080p, but we've also gone back and added high settings for those two resolutions. Drivers used were recommended by Microsoft, AMD, and NVIDIA alongside the required Windows 10 anniversary update, and that includes the NVIDIA 373.02 drivers and AMD 16.10.1, which are the same as 16.9.2 for Gears of War 4. The optimizations are the same in each, and AMD has done some optimizations. We spoke with their team about that. Starting with 1920 by 1080 properly configured to high settings across the board, we're still hitting a bit of a CPU bottleneck with the high-end devices as limited at approximately 155 FPS average with our 5930K at 3.8 GHz, that is the limiter here. The GTX 1080, the old man 980 Ti, and the GTX 1070 are all peaking at around 150 FPS average, showing no issues whatsoever with Gears of War 4 at 1080p with high settings. The low frame rate performance is reasonably tightly timed, with each card dipping at its lowest to 105 FPS at the 0.1% low metric, or the slowest 0.1% of frames output, as represented by frame times. This plants NVIDIA close to 120Hz displays, and actually beyond it, depending on if you're looking at averages or not. And Gears of War 4 isn't exactly a game where you need that. You barely even need 60, honestly, but it's at least doing well with the lows. Moving down the hierarchy, the AMD R9 Fury X is now pushing significantly better performance than what we saw with Ultra, hitting 124 FPS average and lows of 92.8 FPS and 60.3 FPS, respectively. That number is deceptive, though, and it's for the same reasons that we discussed originally. That has not changed. We are still seeing critical variance between test passes with AMD devices, at least some of them, and here's a quick look at some of the raw data from the Fury X running on high settings, where we're seeing, as we were seeing before with Ultra, a dip to 25 FPS for the absolute lowest output in the 0.1% low metrics, not the minimum, but a 0.1% low, and an output of 96.2 FPS for the 0.1% low in another one of the test runs. That's a range of 70 FPS for the absolute lowest performance in 0.1% metrics, which manifests itself occasionally, at least once every minute or two, as a stutter or hitch in frame rate fluidity. And if you look at the averages, you'll see that AMD's R9 Fury X remains fairly consistent in its average output. It's just these low values where it suffers. Now, this is also an important note to make about testing and why our efforts to make this Python script are really worth it this time. Actually, well, it's always worth it, but especially now, because if you look at the minimums output by presentmon, if you use presentmon launcher, or if you're just looking through the data manually, the minimum is really useless. It's almost always an outlier, and when we run through the numbers and look at a 1% and 0.1% metric, we get these outputs that are much more consistent and accurate with what you're seeing on the screen. The minimum, because it's one frame out of thousands, is not really a good representation of the low side performance of cards. That's why we're doing this. Just to quickly show Gears of War 4 at 1080p with the Ultra preset settings, here's a look at the performance on both AMD and NVIDIA with that preset applied. We're seeing 143 FPS average output on the GTX 1080 FTW Hybrid, 98 FPS average output on the R9 Fury X. The difference again is in the low performance when you're seeing some of the stuttering in gameplay, and some of this can be seen in our review of Gears of War 4 already published on the channel. Those stutters do appear during gameplay, but the averages are good for AMD overall, and really, this can be problematic at low-end SKUs for NVIDIA too, like the 1060 at 1440. It's just a matter of AMD and the Coalition working together, hopefully to stabilize the low-end performance for those cards. At 1440 with high settings, the GTX 1080 FTW Hybrid from EVGA is now sitting at 131.7 FPS average with tightly timed lows, including exceptionally consistent low frame time performance as shown in this raw data on the screen, with the 980 Ti trailing. There's a noteworthy gap between Pascal and Maxwell performance when it comes to the low values, and that's something which has been improved upon by NVIDIA for this generation of GPUs. The GTX 1070 and 1060 both handle the game well at 1440p, with the AMD R9 Fury X operating at nearly 89 FPS average, just above the GTX 970 SSC from EVGA and the GTX 1060 Gaming X from MSI at 75 FPS average. Effectively, the 970 and 1060 in this test are identical in performance, and that's really only differentiated by Pascal pushing higher low values. Next, the MSI RX 480 Gaming X at 1316 MHz is operating competitively to the 970 and the 1060 with a 73.8 FPS average, though its low performance is just as variable as we've seen in the other tests that we previously published and will be publishing again in a moment. We saw at least one visible stutter in frame rate output in the test runs, but AMD has a reasonable foundation with its average FPS to improve upon performance in the lows with future updates, as they did with Doom with the 390 series when that card saw a 25% increase just from a driver update about a week or two later. Ultra is sustainable at 1080p on the R9 380X, RX 470, GTX 970 and up. The AMD cards at the low end, again, need some extra adjustment to deal with those drops. As for 1440p at Ultra, we're seeing performance output of about 100 FPS on the GTX 1080, with reasonable lows that are just below 60 FPS, 67.6 FPS on the R9 Fury X, and 62 FPS on the MSI R9 390X. Remember that the low values for AMD are a little deceptive here, again for the same reasons that we just stated previously, since the variance is so great that some test passes will make those values appear higher than they are during certain runs or in extended gameplay. The GTX 1060 has a little bit of trouble with stutters at 1440p, but it could be made playable with the drops down to high from Ultra on a couple of settings like SSR, and the RX 480 is in the same boat and could also be made more fluid with a few fine-tuned setting tweaks. The final chart hasn't changed, nor has the one paragraph of the script talking about it. The tests are all using high settings at 4K and were since the start. At 4K high, Gears of War 4 is handled at approximately 70 FPS by the EVGA 1080 FTW Hybrid, with the 1070 SC falling 34% behind at 53.3 FPS average, and the last generation 980 Ti still outclasses Pascal's 1070 at 57 FPS average, though it does exhibit a wider FPS range overall, which plays to the 1% and 0.1% metrics we're showing. As for AMD, the company is headed up by its Fury X at 50 FPS average, followed by the MSI R9 390X at 43 average, and the RX 480 Gaming X at 38.1 FPS average. 4K is relatively playable across most of the hardware that we've tested here, particularly if you're willing to dip some settings down to medium for the RX 480, because Gears isn't a particularly fast-paced game, and a hard 60 FPS isn't mandated for a good experience, though it may be desired. You could always get away with a slightly lower FPS depending on how you feel about your gameplay. And this next chart shows settings scaling, which also hasn't changed from previously. Here's a look at these settings scaled using some average test passes between devices. This gives an overall look at performance and how it scales between various presets. So if we didn't test the setting that you're interested in, you can use this chart to extrapolate performance relative to the tests we've conducted. There's not a huge visual difference between Ultra and High for the most part, but the VRAM impact is actually somewhat substantial. The game tends to sit at around 4.8 gigabytes, maybe 5. VRAM utilization by the end of the benchmark run alone, not talking about the actual gameplay here, and that's as tested using 8GB GPUs. The metric is output by the game's own built-in performance monitor, though we're not entirely sure how it's measuring VRAM, but it is a newer API, it's low level, and it should, in theory, be more accurate than the VRAM request metric you get from GPU-Z or similar software. And while I've been talking, you should also be seeing visual comparisons using some B-roll we captured of identical test scenarios. That'll help give an idea as to the performance output. With all of the charts updated to properly contain the data that they are meant to reflect, we can now reach a conclusion, and it's really somewhat similar to the original conclusion, which is that for low-end performance, you really need to pay attention to those low values, 1%, 0.1% lows, because those manifest themselves in visible stutters in gameplay that we have B-roll of. This is seen on some NVIDIA cards, though less frequently. The GTX 1060, for example, at 1440p Ultra is not something I would recommend. You'd want to drop down to about high or somewhere maybe in that area to reduce the chance of a stutter being encountered. AMD, it's a bit more of a pervasive issue, and we see this across all of the graphics settings we tested for the most part, and it hopefully is an issue that can be resolved with drivers or a game patch. And in talking to AMD, we know that they are working towards a conclusion. This technically 16.9.2 and 16.10.1 contain the same driver optimizations for Gears of War 4. This is officially stated by AMD, but the future can still hold improvement in that regard with the frame time disparity, we'll call it, where there's less consistency in the frame times one frame to the next on some of the AMD devices. Overall, the game is fairly playable even with the higher end Ultra settings. With high settings, 1080p, you can play on pretty much every card we showed on that benchmark chart. And the same is true for 1440p at high. 4K is a little more different, but it's obviously 4K. So you're at a 200% scaling from 1080p. It's an issue just because of resolution. But overall, the cards that are out this generation pretty much handle Gears of War 4 without too much issue at 1080p. RX 460's pushing it a little bit. You can drop the settings maybe slightly to medium for some fine tuning. And then 1440p, the RX 480 is mostly okay other than those low dips, and you can do some tuning to hopefully resolve some of that to an acceptable level. The 1060 at 1440 high is okay as well for general performance. So thank you again for watching. As always, Patreon link to the post-trial video helps out directly. Links in the description below for more information. I'll see you all next time. And that's what we're doing today. We're benchmarking Gears of War 4. Did you see that? What are you doing?